The phone rang just after breakfast, the shrill tone cutting through the quiet hum of my old refrigerator. I set down my mug and reached for it, my fingers aching in the cool morning air. It was Dr. Lawrence's office. His voice was calm but firm as he confirmed what the last round of tests had already hinted at. I would need thyroid surgery on the 15th. I thanked him, hung up, and sat there for a moment, letting the words sink in. My hands, stiff from arthritis, reached for the phone again. I opened the family group chat, the one with my daughter, her husband, and a few extended relatives who rarely spoke unless there was something to brag about. Slowly, I typed surgeries on the 15th, need a ride home. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Vanessa's reply landed like a slap. I'm not skipping Cabo for you. No apology, no question about what kind of surgery. Just that. Before I could process it, another notification flashed across my screen. It was from Vanessa again, but this one didn't seem meant for me. The words blurred for a moment before snapping into focus. Once she's gone, the house is mine. Just need to keep her happy until then. I froze. The message disappeared. Seconds later, replaced with the polite gray text. This message was deleted. No one in the group acknowledged it. No apology, no oops, wrong chat. Just silence. I stared at the phone, my pulse steadying in a way that felt unnatural. There was no heat of anger, no sting of heartbreak, only a cold, deliberate calm settling over me. In that instant, I knew this wasn't simple selfishness. This was calculation. I set the phone down on the table and reached for my coffee, though it had already gone lukewarm. Outside, the winter sunlight spilled across the snow-dusted garden, the rose bushes bare but still standing. My fingers curled around the mug as if drawing from its fading warmth. The surgery was now just one date on my calendar. But something else had been marked in my mind the moment I understood exactly what I was dealing with. And from that moment on, I would not be playing the role they expected. After Vanessa's message, I found myself drifting into memories I hadn't invited, but couldn't stop. They came in sharp flashes, each one edged with fatigue and the quiet ache of being taken for granted. I was 38 when Mateo died. One rainy April night, a truck crossed the center line and tore my world apart in seconds. I went back to work just 2 weeks later, picking up extra shifts at Memorial Hospital. 16 hours on my feet, double gloves over raw knuckles, living off vending machine coffee and adrenaline. There was no choice. Vanessa was only 12, and bills don't stop for grief. A few years later, I stood at the marina signing away Mateo's fishing boat. He'd saved for years to buy it, and I'd sworn I'd never part with it. But the tuition invoice for Vanessa's private school sat on my kitchen counter, and the deadline was 2 days away. I watched the buyer motor away the boat's white hull, cutting through the water, and told myself it was worth it. When Vanessa was pregnant with my first grandchild, I was just coming out of knee surgery. My doctor had advised at least 3 weeks of rest. I took 5 days. The rest of my vacation time that year went into sitting by her bed, cooking for her cleaning, her apartment, rubbing her swollen ankles, while my own knee throbbed in protest. In our little Midwest suburb, I was the dependable one. Mrs. Keaton from next door brought over casseroles after Mateo's funeral, then started saying things like, "You're the Rock Corinne people, like you don't crumble." The Taylors waved from across the street, asking if I could watch their kids just for a couple of hours, and I always said, "Yes. You're strong, Mom. You'll be fine." I heard it from Vanessa more times than I can count, after the flu, after a fall in the driveway, even after my arthritis diagnosis. It wasn't comfort. It was dismissal wrapped in a compliment. Now, with her Cabo message still glowing in my mind, I couldn't help but wonder if all those years of sacrifice had raised a daughter who loved me, or just someone waiting for the reading of my will. A few days later, I opened the family group chat again. The first thing that filled my screen was a blur of turquoise water, white sand, and sunburned smiles. Vanessa and her friends posed in matching wide-brimmed hats, holding flutes of champagne aloft like trophies. There was a photo of them laughing in a poolside cabana, another of a seafood platter the size of a coffee table. Her "not skipping Cabo for you" message was still there, but it had been buried under a pile of reactions, red hearts, laughing emojis, clinking glasses, most of them from her friends. One came from my own brother-in-law, the kind of man who always claimed to hate drama while pouring lighter fluid on every spark. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't type a word. I just stared at the screen until the brightness made my eyes ache. That afternoon, I went grocery shopping. The wind cut through my coat as I wrestled a bag of cat litter into the trunk. My left knee, stiff and swollen, protested with each bend. By the time I reached my driveway, the ache had deepened into a steady throb. I paused halfway up the steps, balancing the bags against my hip so I could catch my breath. Inside, the house greeted me with silence. No voices, no footsteps, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I set the groceries down on the counter and let my gaze drift toward the living room. From the mantel, Mateo's photograph looked back at me. He was grinning in that way he always did when he thought I was about to scold him, warm a little, mischievous, like he was already forgiven. I walked over, resting my fingers lightly on the edge of the frame. "You'd have known what to do," I whispered, my voice barely carrying in the stillness. The glass reflected my own face alongside his two lives, separated by time, but bound by the same question that now weighed heavier than the bags I'd carried in. The phone buzzed on the counter and I turned toward it. The call came just after lunch. I recognized Dr. Lawrence's number and felt that small, instinctive tightening in my chest before I even answered. His voice was steady, clinical, but it carried the kind of weight that sinks straight into your bones. The biopsy confirmed papillary thyroid carcinoma. He explained the plan: the surgery would be more invasive than we'd thought. They'd have to remove the entire thyroid, maybe even surrounding tissue. Hormone therapy for life. Risks to my voice, to my swallowing, to my energy levels. I listened without interrupting, taking notes the way I used to chart patient updates in the hospital. When he asked if my family had questions, I said no. I didn't tell him that I wasn't going to share this with Vanessa at all. If she wouldn't rearrange a vacation for just surgery, she hadn't earned the truth about cancer. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. Outside, a light snow had started to fall, soft flakes swirling past the kitchen window. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and walked slowly to the hall closet. From the back of the top shelf, I pulled down the fireproof box mat, black, its hinges stiff from disuse. I carried it to the dining table and opened it. Inside were the artifacts of a lifetime's labor. My will, property deeds, a thick folder of investment accounts Mateo had left me. Each document smelled faintly of paper and time. I reached for a manila folder and labeled it in thick black ink, "Final Documents." Into it, I slipped 2 fresh pieces of evidence: a printed screenshot of Vanessa's Cabo reply and the deleted message she'd sent by mistake. I studied the words again, the casual cruelty tucked between them, before sliding the page inside and pressing the folder closed. It wasn't anger driving me. It was clarity. If you can't trust someone with your recovery, you can't trust them with your legacy. I locked the box, returned it to the closet, and stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the doorframe. The decision I'd made was only the beginning. The morning of the surgery passed in a blur of bright lights and clipped voices. By the time the volunteer driver from the senior transport program eased me into my driveway, the anesthesia haze had given way to a deep, dragging exhaustion. He offered to carry my small tote to the door, but pride made me wave him off. I thanked him, shut the door behind me, and stood for a moment in the stillness. The house smelled faintly of lavender cleaner from the day before, the scent sharp against the raw ache in my throat. Each step toward the kitchen pulled at the stitches along my neck, a tight reminder of what had been cut away. Milo, sensing my slower pace, wove carefully between my ankles, his warm fur brushing against me. I reached down to scratch his head, grateful for a living presence that expected nothing but my company. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, leaning against the counter while the water heated. The rhythmic click of the burner gave me something to focus on, besides the soreness radiating through my body. When the tea was ready, I carried it to the oak table that had anchored this kitchen for decades. The wood was worn smooth from years of meals, conversations, and bills paid late at night. I set the mug down and unlocked my phone. The screenshots were still there. Vanessa's blunt refusal, the deleted message that said more than she ever intended. I studied them again, each word carving deeper lines into my understanding of who my daughter had become. In the hospital, I'd been a nurse who knew the difference between a wound that would heal with time and one that would fester if left alone. This was no different. The cut she'd made wasn't just emotional, it was strategic, and I was no longer interested in waiting for it to close on its own. I sipped the tea slowly, the steam warming my face, and placed the phone down beside the mug. The next step in my recovery would not be rest. It would be something far more deliberate. 2 weeks after the surgery, when the bruising had faded to a dull yellow, and my voice had regained some strength, I called Marla Chen. For 25 years, she'd been my attorney, my sounding board, and more often than not, the only person in my life willing to give me the blunt truth. Her downtown office was exactly as I remembered it. Tall shelves lined with casebooks, the faint scent of lemon oil on polished wood, and Marla herself behind her desk. A fountain pen, poised like a conductor's baton. We spoke for a while about my recovery, and then I told her I was ready to make changes. Real changes. She listened, taking notes in her looping, precise handwriting as I dictated. Vanessa Marlowe, my only daughter, would inherit exactly $1. Alongside it, a typed letter. This is the ride you earned. The house the one Mateo and I had built a life in, along with my investment accounts, would be transferred into a trust. Its sole purpose to fund scholarships for nursing students over the age of 50 people like me who had fought for a second chance at building something meaningful. Marla raised an eyebrow, but didn't comment on the pettiness of the dollar or the sharpness of the note. She knew me well enough to understand that every detail was deliberate. When the papers were signed and notarized, I felt the first real breath of relief since Vanessa's Cabo message. Not joy, not satisfaction, just the quiet certainty of having set something in motion that could not be undone. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, the glow from my phone screen lighting the grain of the wood. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard before I began to type. Hope Cabo was wonderful. I'd love to hear about it soon. I read it twice before pressing send. Warm, casual, harmless to anyone who didn't know better. But I knew her. I knew how quickly a little sugar would draw out the arrogance I needed to capture. The phone buzzed almost instantly, and I smiled. The file was about to get thicker. When I met with Marla again later that week, she was already waiting with a fresh draft. She'd read my mind. The will now included what she called a trigger clause. Vanessa would only be notified of its contents if she contacted me about money. No polite updates. No advance warnings. If she wanted to know what I had left behind, she would have to show her hand first. We went over the language carefully, making sure it was airtight. By the time I signed, the weight in my chest had shifted from the heaviness of hurt to the solidity of resolve. The bus dropped me a block from home, and I walked slowly, the cane in my right hand, meeting the pavement in steady rhythm. Arthritis had made every movement deliberate, but I didn't mind. Each creak of the cane felt like punctuation in a sentence I'd been composing for decades, A sentence about boundaries, about self-respect, about what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. In the backyard, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. I trimmed the last of the late autumn roses and pulled weeds from between the flagstones, ignoring the twinge in my knee. Mrs. Keaton waved from her porch and leaned over the fence to tell me about her grandson's college applications. We talked for 10 minutes about nothing urgent, the kind of easy conversation that leaves no trace except a little more warmth in the day. The following evening, I walked to church bingo. The folding chairs and clatter of number chips as familiar as my own kitchen. I laughed when someone shouted bingo too early and had to sit down, embarrassed. On the surface, my life looked exactly the same modest routines, the same small-town rhythms. But underneath the groundwork was done. Every document was in place. Every condition was written. The trap was no longer an idea. It was real, and it was patient. I could go on living as if nothing had changed because in the places that mattered most, everything already had. And sooner or later, the moment I was waiting for would come. It was nearly 4 months before I heard from Vanessa again, aside from the occasional social media blast of champagne brunches and resort spas. Then, little by little, her feed changed. The glossy selfies stopped. The cheerful captions grew thin. By the time I pieced the story together through neighbors and a few mutual acquaintances, her husband's big real estate flip had gone under badly. The kind of badly that leaves debts and burned bridges you can't post away. One afternoon, a package arrived on my porch. Inside was a pale blue silk scarf, the kind that comes folded around a cardboard insert in a too large box. The note was written in looping dramatic script. Thought you'd like this. To make up for not visiting after your surgery. Love, Vanessa. It might have worked on someone else. But as I lifted the scarf, a small slip of paper fluttered to the floor, the store receipt. My name wasn't on it, but my credit card number was. One I'd used on a utility bill last year, apparently copied and kept for moments just like this. I folded the receipt and set it beside my teacup, the silk pooling like water between my fingers. There was no anger this time, just confirmation. A few days later, the phone rang. Vanessa's voice was syrupy, the kind she used when she wanted something, but hadn't decided which emotion to sell yet. Mom, she began warmly. I hate to ask this, but things have been rough. I just need a little help. Nothing huge, maybe $80,000 to get back on my feet. You know I'd pay you back. I let the silence hang for a beat before answering. Let me think about it. She sounded relieved, mistaking my tone for hesitation. We said goodbye, and I set the phone down without another word. Then I reached for my address book, found Marla's number, and pressed call. When she picked up, I didn't bother with small talk. It's time, I said. Marla didn't waste time. Within a week, the envelope was on its way, thick, heavy, and impossible to mistake for anything casual. Inside, Vanessa would find 3 things. First, a certified copy of my new will, the one leaving her exactly $1, and a letter, instead of the life she'd assumed would fall neatly into her lap. Second, printed screenshots of her Cabo messages. Not skipping Cabo for you, and the deleted gem about the house being hers once I'm gone. And third, the note I'd written in neat, deliberate script. When I needed you most, you chose the beach. When you needed me, I chose my dignity. I pictured her face as she read it, the disbelief, the flush of anger, the calculation of how to spin it. I imagined her pacing the gleaming kitchen she'd posted online so many times, phone in hand, hunting for an angle. The calls started that same afternoon. First a clipped, "Mom, we need to talk about this." Then texts, "I think you misunderstood. We should meet in person." By evening, her tone had shifted to pleading, "Please just call me. We can fix this." I didn't answer. The next morning, The emails began longer, winding paragraphs that mixed apologies with half-buried accusations. I skimmed the first two before deleting them unread. From my recliner by the living room window, I watched the phone light up again and again on the side table. Milo, purring softly in my lap, shifted when I reached for my tea instead of the handset. The warmth of the mug in my hands was steadier than any of the false warmth in her messages. By the third day, I opened my contacts, scrolled to Vanessa's name, and pressed block. The screen went still. The silence was clean, absolute. And for the first time in months, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't come from reconciliation, only from closing a door you know should never open again. 6 months later, I stood in front of a modest brick building in downtown Rockford, a pair of gold-handled scissors resting in my hands. The banner above the door read, Rockford Nursing Scholarship Fund, Campus Office. Around me, nursing students of every age, some with gray in their hair, others still balancing coursework with young children, gathered in coats and scarves, their faces bright with anticipation. I wore my navy dress and a string of pearls Mateo had given me on our 10th anniversary. The wind was brisk, but it carried the warmth of something earned. When the cameras turned my way, I smiled and spoke into the microphone. Loyalty, I began, is shown in the hardest hours, not the easiest days. These scholarships are for those who have already proven their resilience, not by what they say, but by what they do. I didn't mention Vanessa. I didn't need to. The applause rose up from the small crowd, the sound echoing faintly off the downtown storefronts. I cut the ribbon, and the students cheered as the doors opened behind us. They filed inside to see the study lounge, the resource library, the small kitchen stocked with donated coffee and snacks. I lingered outside for a moment longer, watching them claim the space as if it had always belonged to them. On the walk back to my car, my cane tapped a steady rhythm against the sidewalk. The sky was the pale blue of late winter, and I drew in the crisp air, slowly letting it settle in my lungs. My scarf shifted in the breeze, and my fingers brushed the faint scar along my throat, smooth now, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. It was more than a mark from surgery. It was a reminder that I had healed twice, once in my body and once in my soul. I opened the car door, glanced once more at the bustling office behind me, and felt no pull toward what I'd left behind. I mended the wound in my neck and cut away the rot from my life.